Welcome to Sunday Night Middle School Youth Group. Hope you guys have had a good time this evening. I know you've been treated very well by Jason and Amy. Please thank them for their hospitality before you leave. We are ready to get started on Jesus' ministry. Notice the subtitle on this slide. Yep, the countdown to the cross is a mere 3 years. Over the last couple of lessons, we've seen God at work getting everything in order so that Jesus can begin his ministry. Though it seems much longer, his ministry of healing, preaching, and teaching only lasted 3 years. We're going to mostly be looking in the book of John this evening. John wrote his gospel later than Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and he gives us some information that the others don't contain. In fact, the other three don't record much of Jesus' first year of ministry at all. But John does record that first year, so that's where we are going to begin. Let's look at the things that have had to take place before Jesus could start his ministry. He had to be at least 30 years of age according to the law in the Old Testament books. For anyone who was going to be a prophet, priest, or king, they had to be at least 30. We've seen the baptism by John and that Jesus told him it was necessary that took place before his ministry could begin. Then last week we looked at how he underwent the temptations by Satan, and so that we know that he was tempted in all the ways that we are tempted, and that he can understand what we go through when we are tempted. So now let's look at the area where Jesus ministered. You should have a copy of this map. This is Galilee or Israel during the time of Jesus. Israel wasn't a free country during this time, but it was a province under Roman rule. The Romans called this area Palestine. It came from a Greek word that meant home of the Philistines, which was an ancient group of people that used to live there. You'll notice on this map that there are some areas that I have circled in purple. Those words are not cities. Those are the names of the regions in Palestine. Different Roman rulers ruled over each of these areas. The yellow star down by the Dead Sea at the base of the Jordan River is where John the Baptist did his baptisms, and it's where Jesus was baptized as well. You'll see a gray area that I outlined, the wilderness area. It actually extended onto both sides of the Dead Sea, up around the top and over to the west side as well, but I couldn't squeeze all that in on the map. But that's the area where Jesus was taken for to be tempted by Satan. Notice how narrow this country is. If you look at the scale at the bottom of right side of the paper, you'll see that not very much width there is only 30 miles. The country as a whole is only 270 miles long. It's only 85 miles wide, and it's actually only about the size of New Jersey. In fact, if you measure it in square miles, Indiana is 4 times bigger than Israel. So we're not talking about a very big country. Now, using the map that you're given, get out your Bibles and look up these 4 passages and follow the directions on the slide for marking on your map. We can pause the slide here so that you can get that done. So that last verse you looked up, John chapter 2, verse 1, tells us that Jesus wanted to go to Galilee. Let's look closer at that area. Galilee was the northern area of Israel, and it was composed of Jews, but also a lot of Gentiles or non-Jewish people lived there as well. There were a lot of Roman outposts that were there, so a lot of Roman soldiers lived in the area. And there were also several trade routes that passed through the area, which would bring people from all over the world, most of them who were not Jewish. That kind of created a problem for this area because the Jews that were in Jerusalem, in the area of Judea, considered themselves much more upper class and considered themselves more pure Jews. The towns in Galilee were very small. Capernaum was one of the largest on the Sea of Galilee, but compared to Jerusalem, Galilee was made up of working class people, not royalty, and certainly not the priestly people. Most of them were poor and uneducated. Jerusalem was just the opposite. Lots of wealthy people, highly educated priests, and the temple made Jerusalem the place to be. So the Jews in Jerusalem looked down their noses at the Galilean Jews. They felt that the Jews in Galilee were kind of dirty since they had to rub shoulders with the Gentiles all the time. Listen to what Nathanael has to say to Philip in John chapter 1, verse 45 through 46. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And Philip said to him, "Come and see." So it seems that Nazareth was even looked down on by the other towns in Galilee. So it was kind of the armpit of the world. Interestingly, Jesus does not do much of his ministry around Jerusalem, but does most of his ministry in the Galilee region. So here we see that Jesus and his disciples are going to head from Bethsaida over to Cana. Let's look at the towns that are around the Sea of Galilee in this Galilee region. These cities are actually tiny little towns, and most of them depend on the fishing business that's around the Sea of Galilee. At least half of Jesus' disciples come from this area, and they were all fishermen. The first 6 had heard John the Baptist preach, and they became his followers. And they were convinced by John that the Messiah was coming soon, and they later followed Jesus. John the Baptist pointed Jesus out to Andrew and John, who then spent an afternoon and a whole night with Jesus, and they were convinced by his teaching that he was the Messiah. Andrew immediately found his brother Peter and told him that he had found the Messiah. So Andrew and Peter, we see, are brothers. Andrew, Peter, and Philip are all from Bethsaida. All right. And then James and John were also brothers, and they were from the town of Capernaum. Even though Peter and Andrew were from Bethsaida, their fishing business was located in Capernaum. They were in partnership with James and John in a fishing business. Nathanael was actually from the town of Cana, and he was good friends with Philip. In fact, when Philip found out who the Messiah was, he immediately went to get Nathanael. So why was it that Jesus wanted to go to Galilee? Because he had a wedding to attend. Now, on your map, these routes don't look too difficult, but when you look at this map and see how the land is laid out, you can see that the trips on foot would have been much more difficult than we would first think. Look at all the mountains and valleys they would have to cross just to get from Bethsaida to Cana. Now, Jesus has this party to attend, and it's going to be more important than just a party, more important than just a wedding. Look closely at this picture. At first, nothing seems out of the ordinary until you notice that what's in the picture is not what is filling the glass. That'd be a great parlor trick if we could pull it off, but Jesus managed to do this for real. Turning water into wine at the wedding at Cana is one of the first of 8 different sign miracles that John records in his letter to prove that Jesus is God. All of these signs were included in the book of John to prove Jesus's deity, that he is actually God. In John 20, verse 30, it says that many of the signs were not included, not written down in his book. And then in John 21, verse 35, John makes the comment that if he had included all the details about all the miracles that Jesus had done, all the books of the world couldn't include everything he had accomplished. When we look at this, we want to say that these signs are miracles. Signs always point to something. These are more than just coincidences. These are things that these are something that only God can do. True miracles are that. These miracles prove that Jesus was God because he has this ability. So the signs not only point to Jesus, they also prove that he is who he said he was. Now, about this wedding, Jesus and his family would certainly have been invited. Nazareth and Cana aren't very far apart. Notice that it says that Mary is there, and she seems to be helping with the refreshments. Before we go any further, I guess we ought to read that story. Turn in your Bibles to John chapter 2. It says, on the third day there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it. When the master of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. Let's take a look at this passage. One thing that we need to understand about weddings and at this time in history was that a couple was engaged for an entire year, and a wedding lasted for an entire week. It was considered the social event of a person's life, and definitely an important social event in the life of the villages. The week-long celebration was the responsibility of the bridegroom. He had a whole year to get everything in order to prove to the bride's father that he could take care of his new wife. He had to build a home, even if it was adding on a room to his father's existing home, so that he could provide a place for her. And then all of the cost of the week-long celebration was his responsibility as well. This was to prove to everyone that he was capable of taking care of his new bride. So for them to run out of wine during this festival was a major catastrophe. It was a breakdown in the bridegroom being able to provide for his wife. So what seems to us like something minor was actually really something major in that day and age. The other thing that's important about this being Jesus's first miracle is that it gives us the idea that God must consider marriage really important. If the very first miracle Jesus ever performs is at a wedding, that's as though God is giving his stamp of approval on marriage. Weddings are important. Celebrations are important. Now, let's also look at some of the things in this miracle that are important to understand why it's such a big deal. Jesus' very first miracle is done for the people that he's known all his life. He's grown up in Nazareth, a tiny little village, and he has been totally out of the limelight all of that time. He's pretty much lived his life in obscurity. But the first miracle he does is going to be for the friends and family, the people who have seen him grow up. Now, Cana and Galilee are very close together. Nazareth is a town of only about 500. Cana would be just a few dozen families. So definitely the people would have known each other. So when we see actually what happens, we see some important things here. First of all, it tells us that the servants were involved. These people are going to be witnesses to what Jesus had done. It's not going to be something he does in secret. So the servants are bringing the water pots to him. Now, those water pots are actually, the people don't drink water in that day and age because the water was contaminated with bacteria. So they always mix their water with some wine. So these pots, it tells us these big stone jugs that held about 30 gallons each. By the way, that'd be 180 gallons of wine that we're going to come up with here. Those stone jars held water that was used for ritual washings. The Jews had lots of rules and laws about how they had to wash their hands and how they had to wash their utensils and all of that. So this water was dirty water that was used to clean people's hands and to clean the utensils. And Jesus is going to use that nasty water and turn it into the best wine the world has ever seen. It also when he talks about the fact that they were in stone jars, that lets us know these were not clay pots. Clay pots are porous. Wine that could have been stored in those pots would have seeped out maybe from the clay into water and might have made the water taste a little bit like wine. But the Bible's specific when it tells us that these jars were made of stone. Stone doesn't absorb anything. Besides that, they weren't used for holding wine. They only held water. When we see that the water is turned into wine, Jesus does it instantaneously. It is perfect wine. It's aged to perfection. It shows that Jesus has power over nature. He didn't have to start with vines and seeds and grapes in order to make wine. He just made the wine out of nothing. The water becomes wine. It's perfect wine. It's the best tasting wine. In fact, it's so good that the bride's father is so impressed. He calls the bridegroom over and says, well, usually everybody serves the best wine first. And then when everybody gets a little bit tipsy, then they throw in the cheap stuff and nobody really notices. He said, but you have saved the best wine for last. And he was so impressed with his new son-in-law. Jesus has power over time in this miracle as well, in that good wine takes years and years and years to ferment and to age, and Jesus does it instantly. The result from all of this, it tells us in the last couple of verses, is that the disciples believed that Jesus was God, because obviously this is a miracle that only God could perform. Now, another really important thing about this miracle, not just the purpose of starting Jesus's ministry with a bang, not just the purpose of getting his disciples to believe, not just the purpose of honoring marriage, not just the purpose of showing that he is God, but there's one more purpose for this miracle that might not be noticeable right at the beginning. This miracle was used to divide people into groups. What I mean by that is the way people respond to this miracle is going to determine which one of these three groups they automatically fall into. Look up these three verses and fill in the blanks, and then we'll talk about it. It's amazing, isn't it, how people responded? Every human being can be divided into one of these three groups depending on their response to Jesus's miracles. That was true then, and it's true now. Some people will become believers, some will not. But the saddest group is those who believe that the miracles, who believe in the miracles, but they're afraid to admit it. This verse says that they were among the rulers. These aren't government rulers like we would think, but the word rulers here actually means they were leaders in the local synagogues. In other words, they were the spiritual leaders of the people, and they didn't want to lose their membership in the local synagogue. They didn't want to admit they believed in Jesus because they were afraid of what other people would think. As Christians, we have even more evidence to believe that Jesus is the Son of God than any of these folks did. After all, we know about the resurrection and they didn't because it hadn't happened yet. And yet today there are still many people who refuse to believe in Jesus. And there are also those people who do believe in Jesus, but who don't want to admit it because of what others might think about them. Where are you? Which group do you fall into? Next week, we'll look at what happens to Jesus after this miracle is performed. And now, a few snapshots from Ireland.